Alright, so today we're going to go over changing a power steering return line, the return hose on a Saab 9.3. It's this hose right here. If you look down, this is the suction hose for the power steering pump. This is the return hose from the steering rack to the reservoir right here. So this hose is a little bit problematic, and it's typical on Saabs to leak and go bad. If you look right here, it actually has some stress cracking right there. And that's just from engine bay heat and age. These little 2-liter 4-cylinder turbos, they make some pretty good power, but they also make a lot of heat. It gets hot under this engine bay with the hood closed. And it kind of bakes the soft rubber hoses surrounding the engine. That's one thing about these Saabs. You really should check the hoses. This car has 108,000 miles, and like the blow-off valve hose going to the control solenoid right here, well, this was all baked, and I recently replaced that, and it actually solved the check engine issue. So I'm going to be going over changing this hose out today, and just showing you how to kind of make your own hose. One of the main things about this hose is that down here is 13 millimeters. The nipple on the reservoir is for a 13 millimeter hose, and on the steering rack down in here, it's hard to see, but if you look down there, you'll see a metal clamp on the actual rack. That's 10 millimeters, and this is a pre-formed hose, which means it's created in a mold. And again, one end, the reservoir end, is at 13 millimeters, the rack end is at 10 millimeters. So that kind of poses some issues with just trying to use a hose with the same inside diameter at both ends. It's not that simple, but I'm going to show you how to do it. Alright, so to get started, we're going to get some of the old fluid out of the reservoir, actually as much as we can. Take the lid off. There we go. And right here I have a syringe. You can get these at the hardware store with some clear tubing on it. Syringe and clear tubing. Now I'm basically going to put that tubing down in the reservoir, and I'm just going to draw out as much fluid as I can until that reservoir is pretty much empty. The reason why I want to do this is so that when I take the return line off the bottom of the reservoir, the power steering fluid doesn't, well, dump all over the transmission and the driveway. Alright, so our reservoir is nice and drained now. So I'm going to go ahead and put the cap back on just to keep dust and debris out. Back on. By the way, drain your syringe into a nice used oil container. Have that handy. Makes things a lot easier. And keep a rag with you. So actually wipe your gloves off and your syringe and hose when you're done. Alright, so I'm going to be using a 1/4" drive ratchet with a 7 millimeter socket and extension and a flat blade screwdriver. I may or may not need to use that. And I'm going to be taking off, it's kind of hard to see down here, but see that idle clamp right there? This guy? You need to loosen that. That's the idle clamp that's going to hold the hose onto the reservoir. So I'm going to go ahead and take that off right now. And let's see here. There we go. Get her on there. Alright, so I've loosened the idle clamp, and the hose is about to come off, but before I pop it off, I put a rag underneath to catch some of the fluid, because quite a bit is going to come out probably. There it goes. See that? Now get the hose out as fast as you can and kind of sit it up. Sit it up here. Just rest it on the reservoir, because that thing is full of fluid. I always like to try to avoid dumping fluid everywhere and making a mess. Do the best you can. Alright, next thing you want to do is remove this. And all this is a simple little clamp, hose to hose clamp, and all it's doing is securing the hoses so they don't move around too much. And you can just tip it out of the way. That's it. Good to go. Next, I'll be loosening the actual 8/0 clamp on the return rack line. Now somebody did zip tie this together at one point. I'm going to cut that zip tie down there now. Alright, so I cut the zip tie on the two hoses. There's the zip tie, cut it, took it off. And now I've begun to get the hose clamp off. Now, you kind of got to fish your ratchet and extension and 7mm socket over the brake booster bracket. It will do it. And as you can see down in there, the flashlight, I am on the 8/0 clamp and I'm currently taking it off. Now this is probably could be pretty frustrating for a lot of people. A lot of people would say, hey, you know, that's way too hard. I don't think it's that bad. I've worked on stuff a long time. It's absolutely doable. It just takes a little bit of time and some patience. Alright, so getting this power steering line on through here is pretty tough, and I was, you know, pretty much cursing Saab out for putting this line down behind the brake booster and having this fuse box right here. But then, lo and behold, I found a better way, and yeah, I'm a little, I don't know if I call it embarrassed, but just like, it's one of those dumb moments. So down here, with the wheel and tire off, look at this giant opening. So that's the tie rod. It's the pass-through in the body and the sheet metal for the tie rod to move. And if you look up in there, so I can get a good shot. Maybe I can, maybe I can't. But the hose that I've been working on is easily accessible up through here. And if you look, I can just put my hand easily right up in there and get to everything. I mean, the hose is right there. I can get a screwdriver up in there and mess with that 8/0 clamp, work the hose on to the rigid line, the rubber hose on. So Saab actually, they did a pretty good job here. And if you're trying to get that hose on, just using the opening for the tie rod to move through is the best way to get the power steering rack to reservoir return line on and the 8/0 clamp tightened. Alright, to just give you an idea of why this hose is actually leaking, that's it right there. Look at that. That crack opening up. That is a prime example of the hose just being dried out and aged to the point it's cracking multiple spots. I mean, look at this one over here. Due to heat. The heat just in the engine bay just baked this thing and produces all these cracks everywhere. Eventually, those cracks make it all the way through the webbing inside the hose and through the final layer of rubber, and it just starts weeping power steering fluid. Alright, so next we're going to go ahead and fab up the new hose. Alright, so I've got the stock power steering hose at the top and the piece of 1/2 inch and 3/8 hose with a barb fitting to join the two together on the bottom, and 4 hose clamps. I am going to try to reuse the stock hose clamps on the ends where they went on the stock hose. Well, they're in good shape. They're nicely constructed aluminum hose clamps, and they're what the factory used, so I'm going to stick with those. The other 2 hose clamps are nice stainless steel pieces that should really resist corrosion. Just so everybody knows, 13mm comes out to about 1/2 inch, and 10mm for the rack side comes out to about 3/8. Alright, 3/8 inch right there. Get this one. 1/2 inch right there. Alright, so this should be This should work pretty good. I'm going to see how it goes. And once I get it all right together, I'll show you the final piece and then install it. Alright, so there's my assembled hose. I'm going to go ahead and give this a whirl. See how she installs. Alright, so the hose is on, the new hose, and so is the clamp, as you can see down there. It was pretty challenging. I had to climb up on top of the motor up here and get my right hand down around this rigid hose that the hose I just put on the return line is next to, and help guide it on. So it was kind of challenging, and you know, it took patience and not getting upset at the the fact that it wasn't going on so easy. One thing I did do to help myself out was use some of this. So this is STP oil treatment, and it is awesome for getting things to go together. I put this on wheel bearings when I press in wheel bearings, and I've also put it on hoses. This was no different. I put some in the end of the hose, just a little bit, and it's really thick and gloopy, but has great lubricative properties, and it really helped that slip right on the steering rack line. Alright, so next, as you can see, well, I've routed this hose under the strut tower bar by the brake reservoir where the stock one went, and now I'm going to work on getting the other side on the reservoir. However, to help myself out, I'm going to remove the power steering pump suction line, because the attachment nipple for the return line is right under that, and taking this suction line off, it's just going to help me a lot, and it's right there and it's easy. As you can see, I slid it right off, get the hose clamp off, get it out of the way, and I don't know if you can see it, maybe you can, maybe you can't, but the actual connection is right under it down here. Alright, so I'm going to pop that on now. Alright, so the power steering hose assembly is completely installed now. One note, I did have to end up replacing the stock clamp with an auto parts store one, because it just didn't feel right and it wasn't tightening properly, so I took it off and replaced it. So that's all nice and tightened up. The suction line's tightened up, and then up here I pushed the fittings in the rest of the way and went ahead and tightened these hose clamps up. And just remember, when you're tightening hose clamps, you really only want to make them good and snug. You don't want to actually have the rubber popping through underneath these little cuts where the threads work on the clamp. That means you've over tightened and you're actually damaging the hose material. So now I'm going to go ahead and add power steering fluid, and then we'll fire it up and do a leak check to make sure we're not leaking. Now, something important to make sure you do with your Saab is make sure you get a European blend of power steering fluid. I got this at the local auto parts store. The big thing you want to look for is this right here, CHF11S. Alright, that it meets that spec. And if you look, there you go, Porsche, Saab, Volvo, Jaguar, Mini, on and on. So this is approved to the spec that Saab originally made the power steering to, that specification. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and fill this up right now. Alright, so I went ahead and filled the reservoir, and what you're looking for when you fill this back up is that it comes to the bottom of that, the line closest to the end of the dipstick, that's full cold. Alright, you want to fill it up to that. Put the cap back on. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and start this now and do a leak check. And what you're looking for on a leak check is you start it up and basically just look for leaks at all the fittings you've had apart. So I'm going to check here. I'm going to give a good look with the flashlight down there. And I'm going to check my suction and my return line to the reservoir. Also, you want to go ahead and give your power steering a little bit of a bleed by moving the steering wheel back and forth a couple times. That'll get any air bubbles out of the steering. Alright, so just did a quick test drive and everything checks out okay. There was a little bit of leakage from the return line clamp I put on the brand new one. I went ahead and tightened that up and the leak stopped. So, good thing to do is drive this car for a couple days when you do a power steering line like this, and then go back and tighten up your clamps, all your clamps, because what will happen is the expansion and contraction of heating up and cooling down, especially on new clamps, they'll stretch a little bit and need tightened up. Another thing, just so everyone knows, the best way to bleed air out of the steering system is to jack up the car, actually get it off the ground, up in the air on jack stands, and with the engine running, rotate the steering wheel back and forth from lock to lock, okay? That will get most of the air out of the lines, if not all of it. You can also just drive the car around, but that can be a little bit hard on the steering rack components and the pump itself, because cavitation for power steering pumps isn't really good for them. Alright, so that's it. Again, drive the car for a couple days and then tighten up all your hose clamps. Alright, stay rolling greasy.
They see me rolling greasy.